Today I want to talk about the Stone of Destiny. In the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey in London is an oblong block of sandstone, upon which all of England's kings have been crowned for several centuries. And before that, the kings of Scotland, and before them, the kings of Ireland. This is another bit of evidence of the identity of the Anglo-Saxon people as the Israel of the Bible, and that the house of David still rules over them. The history of this stone begins in the 28th chapter of Genesis, where we read that Jacob camped overnight in the field, and for his pillow used a stone with his folded cloak over it. During the night, God appeared to him in a vision and promised to give him the land of Canaan. When Jacob awoke, he said, "This is the house of God," and named the place Bethel, meaning house of God. Then he took the stone he had used as his pillow and set it up as a monument, and dedicated it with an offering of oil. He promised that if God would help him, then shall Yahweh be my God, and this stone which I have set for a monument shall be God's house. In Genesis 35, God instructs him to go back to Bethel and set up an altar to God, which Jacob did. It was at this time that God changed Jacob's name to Israel, and Israel again set up and dedicated as a monument of witness the stone pillar which he had dedicated as God's house. Its sacred character was now firmly established. We next find mention of it in Genesis 49, when the aged Israel, before he dies, tells his 12 sons what will befall their respective descendants in the last days. Speaking of Joseph, he says, "From thence is the shepherd of the stone of Israel." We should therefore expect to find the stone in the custody of the sons of Joseph in the last day. The English are the tribe of Ephraim, descended from one of Joseph's sons. Its sacred character having been established, the stone would not be thereafter abandoned. We next hear of it when the children of Israel, in their exodus from Egypt, were facing death by thirst in the desert. God instructed Moses, "I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink." And thus they were saved from death. This miracle was repeated later, but this time Moses was instructed merely to speak to the rock, not strike it. Because Moses disobeyed God and hit the rock in a grandstand play before the people, he was not allowed to enter the promised land. We must not think that this rock was merely the native rock cliffs of these desert places, for in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 to 4, Paul says, "All our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." That is, they were given water to drink from a rock which was carried along with them. And as Israel had said, "This stone which I have set up for a monument shall be God's house." So Christ hallowed it with his presence. After Joshua had conquered the promised land and divided it among the 12 tribes, he reminded them they must ever be loyal to God, and he set up a stone as a monument of witness to this warning. The Hebrew says he took the stone of greatness, and what would that be, or what more fitting witness could there be, but the stone which was God's house? Before God ever allowed Israel to have a king, the rebel Abimelech had himself crowned king beside this pillar or monument, as we read in Judges 9, verse 6. Later, when the lawful monarchy was established in the house of David, we find it was the custom that the king be crowned standing by the pillar or monument, where we read in 2 Kings 11, verses 12 to 14, "And he brought forth the king's son, and put the crown upon him, and gave him the testimony. And they made him king, and anointed him, and they clapped their hands, and said, God save the king. And when Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she came to the people into the temple of Yahweh. And when she looked, behold, the king stood by a pillar, as the manner was, and the princes and the trumpeters by the king, and all the people of the land rejoiced. The stone had become a sacred relic, a witness of the mutual promises of God and of the children of Israel. It would be found close to the temple and close to the throne. Upon the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, 2 Maccabees 2, verses 4 to 8 says that ancient records stated that Jeremiah had taken the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle and had hidden them in the cave on Mount Nebo. While 1 Samuel chapters 4 and 5 record the capture of the ark by the Philistines and its return, there is no mention of it being taken by the Babylonians, so the ancient record of the ark being hidden must be correct. Along with the ark, we may be sure that Jeremiah would also safely hide the sacred witness stone, God's house, which had twice been used to give water to the people to save them from death, and which was now used in the coronation of the kings. When I spoke to you on what Jeremiah planted, I told you how Jeremiah and the daughters of the last king of Judah, Zedekiah, were taken to Egypt with the refugees. But in order to fulfill God's prophecy that Jeremiah was also to build and to plant, Jeremiah had to leave Egypt and to take the princess to where another Israelite kingdom was then in existence, in Ireland. We know that with Jeremiah went Baruch, his scribe, and the king's daughter, and with the princess he would also certainly take the hidden stone upon which the kings were crowned. The ancient Irish chronicles record the coming of the great prophet with his scribe, Baruch, obviously Baruch, and the daughter of the king, about 583 B.C., which would be the correct date, and that with them they brought the wonderful stone, or stone of destiny. A woman of my acquaintance belongs to a family whose genealogy shows that one of their ancestors came to Ireland with Jeremiah, and that this ancestor's duty was that of custodian of the stone. Teotepi, the king's daughter, married Eochaid, the Heremon, or chief king of Ireland. The stone, called Leothale, or stone of destiny, was kept at the capital city of Tara for some 3 centuries, and all the kings, descendants of Eochaid and Teotepi, were crowned on it. Then, about 350 B.C., it was sent to Scotland for the coronation of Fergus, king of Scots, who was a descendant of the Milesian kings of Ireland. It remained in Scotland, and all Scottish kings were crowned on it until 1297 A.D., when King Edward I of England invaded Scotland and captured the stone, which he took to England, where it was placed in Westminster Abbey, its home ever since that date. It was built into the coronation chair, which is the oldest piece of furniture in England, still serving its original purpose, and all English kings have been crowned on it ever since. Its origin was well known during the entire time it has been in the British Isles, and from practically the first it was called Jacob's Stone. William of Rislanger, writing in the 13th century, records the coronation of John de Balliol as King of Scotland in the year 1292 upon the stone on which Jacob placed his head. While the 10-tribe nation of Israel had to abide many days without a king, as God prophesied in Hosea 3, verse 4, yet there must always be a royal family of David's line on the throne over some Israelite people. For God promised through Jeremiah 33, verse 17, that David shall never lack a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel. We know that Eochaid the Heremon was in the Milesian line of kings of Ireland, and that the Milesians in Ireland were the descendants of Zara, a son of Judah, and that Teotepi was a descendant of David, who was also of the royal tribe of Judah, through Judah's other son, Phares. So the 2 royal lines of Judah were united with the marriage of Eochaid and Teotepi, and a descendant of David was always on the throne over Israelite people, as God had promised. The Ark of the Covenant belonged in the temple, and the temple was not to be a continuous institution like the throne of David. So it is not surprising that the Ark has disappeared from history, and probably will not be revealed again until Jesus Christ returns to reign upon the throne of David, as is prophesied in Isaiah 9, verse 7. But the throne was to be a continuous throne, as we saw in Jeremiah 33, verse 17. Therefore, it is only logical that the coronation stone, which the Hebrews had called the stone of majesty and the pillar of witness, should be found where the throne of David had its continued existence. After all, it was the pillar of witness, for it had been made witness both to Israel's promise to be Yahweh's people and Yahweh's promise to be their God. It should be there as a witness that Yahweh always makes good his promises, and that David shall never lack a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel.